We made it through the storm.
Aye. With you by my side.
I was so scared.
We're safe now, love.
The mountain man raised his rifle, his weathered hands trembling, not from cold, but from rage at what he saw in the town square below. 3 young men circled a heavy-set woman in tattered clothes, their cruel laughter echoing off the wooden storefronts as she clutched a broken breadbasket and tried to shield her face. Caleb Rourke hadn't pointed a weapon at another human being in 15 years, not since the day he buried his wife and swore he was done with the world. But watching them shove that girl into the frozen mud ignited something he thought had died long ago. Before we begin this story of second chances in the unforgiving frontier, I invite you to join me on this journey. Please hit that like button and comment with the city you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this tale of redemption travels across the world. The winter of 1823 came to Red Ridge Valley like a vengeful spirit, howling down from the granite peaks with ice in its teeth and murder in its wind. Snow fell in sheets so thick a man could lose his way between his cabin door and his woodpile. The pines bent under the weight of frozen white, their branches creaking like the bones of old men, and the creek that ran through the valley floor turned to solid stone beneath a winter sky the color of gunmetal. Caleb Rourke stood at the single window of his log cabin, one hand braced against the rough-hewn frame, watching the storm swallow the last of the daylight. He was 50 years old, though the mountains had aged him beyond his years. His face was all hard angles and deep lines, carved by wind and sun and sorrow. Gray streaked through his dark beard, and his pale blue eyes held the distant look of a man who had seen too much and felt too little. The cabin around him was neat but spare, a testament to a life stripped down to its bare essentials. A narrow bed in one corner, a scarred wooden table with a single chair, shelves holding tin plates, a coffee pot, a few bags of cornmeal and dried beans, a stone fireplace where a small fire burned, just enough to keep the worst of the cold at bay, but no more. Caleb had learned long ago not to waste wood on comfort. He turned from the window and moved to the fireplace, adding a single log with the careful precision of a man who counted every resource. The flames caught, sending shadows dancing across the log walls, and for a moment the cabin felt almost warm. Almost. But warmth was a memory now, like so many other things. Caleb's wife, Margaret, had died 16 years ago, taken by fever in 3 terrible days that left him holding her hand and begging a God he'd stopped believing in to take him instead. His son, Thomas, had left Red Ridge 8 years back, headed east toward the cities and a life that didn't include his bitter, broken father. The last letter had come 2 years ago from somewhere in Pennsylvania. Caleb had read it once and then burned it in this same fireplace, watching the words turn to ash because they hurt too much to keep. The people in Red Ridge Valley still knew his name, but they kept their distance. Once, Caleb Rourke had been a legend in these mountains, the tracker who could find a lost child in a blizzard, the hunter who brought down elk to feed the settlement through harsh winters, the fighter who'd stood against raiding parties and wild animals with equal fearlessness. Men had sought his guidance. Women had trusted him with their children's safety. Now they just nodded politely when he came to town for supplies, their eyes sliding away, uncomfortable with the ghost he'd become. Caleb told himself he preferred it this way. Solitude was honest. It didn't pretend to care and then leave you standing in a graveyard with dirt under your fingernails and a hole in your chest. The mountains didn't lie to you. The winter didn't promise things it couldn't deliver. A man alone could control his world, small as it was, and that was enough. It had to be enough, because at 50, with his back aching more each morning and his hands getting stiffer with each passing winter, Caleb knew his story was winding down. He was waiting, really. Waiting for the day his body would give out on a hunting trail, or a storm would be too much, or he'd simply lie down in his narrow bed and not bother getting up. He'd stopped thinking about the future in any meaningful way. There was only the next day, and the day after that, an endless string of identical moments leading nowhere in particular. He thought these things every night, and every morning he rose before dawn anyway, built up the fire, made his coffee, and went through the motions of survival because it was the only thing he knew how to do. The storm lasted 3 days. When it finally broke, Caleb strapped on his snowshoes and made the long trek down to Red Ridge for supplies. The settlement sat in a sheltered hollow where the valley widened, a collection of rough wooden buildings clustered around a trading post, a blacksmith's forge, and a small general store. Maybe 40 people called it home, most of them trappers, traders, and farmers tough enough to survive this far from civilization. The snow lay waist deep between the buildings, and the air was so cold it burned going down. Caleb made his way to the general store, nodding to a few familiar faces but not stopping to talk. He'd learned years ago that conversations led to questions about how he was doing, and he had no patience for polite lies. He was coming out of the store, a sack of cornmeal under one arm and a small bag of coffee beans in his coat pocket, his one luxury, when he heard the laughter. It came from the town square, such as it was, a cleared space between the store and the trading post where people gathered on market days. 3 young men stood in a loose circle, their breath steaming in the frozen air, their voices loud with the particular cruelty of youth that hasn't yet learned consequences. In the center of their circle was a woman. Caleb stopped, his hand tightening on the sack of cornmeal. She was heavy-set, wrapped in a coat several sizes too large and patched in a dozen places. Her dress, visible beneath the coat's hem, was threadbare and stained. She clutched a woven basket to her chest, and even from 20 yards away, Caleb could see it was broken, the handle torn half away. Loaves of bread lay scattered in the snow around her feet. "Look at her," one of the young men said, loud enough for half the settlement to hear. He was tall and rangy, maybe 25, with the swagger of someone who'd never been truly tested. Fat as a Christmas goose and twice as stupid. "Probably ate half the bakery's bread herself," another one added, circling around behind her. "That's why old Mueller can barely pay her." The woman, Caleb thought her name might be Eliza, though he'd never spoken to her, tried to gather the fallen bread, bending down awkwardly. The tall one kicked snow over the nearest loaf, and his companions roared with laughter. "Leave it," the tall one said. "It's ruined anyway, just like everything you touch." Eliza's face was red, though whether from cold or shame, Caleb couldn't tell. She didn't look at the young men, didn't respond to their taunts. She just kept trying to salvage the bread, her movements slow and deliberate, as if by ignoring them she could make them disappear. It didn't work. It never did. The third young man, shorter and stockier than the others, grabbed the basket from her hands and held it high above his head. "Looking for this?" Caleb felt something shift inside his chest, like ice cracking on a frozen river. He'd spent 15 years telling himself he was done with other people's problems, that his days of standing between the strong and the weak were over, that a man his age had earned the right to look away, to mind his own business, to let the world sort itself out without his interference. But watching Eliza Hartley on her knees in the snow, watching those boys circle her like wolves on a wounded deer, something long buried clawed its way to the surface. He set down his sack of cornmeal very carefully, propping it against the store's wall. Then he walked toward the square. His footsteps were quiet in the snow, but something about his approach made the tall one glance over his shoulder. The laughter died a little. "Morning, Mr. Rourke," the young man said, his tone suddenly cautious. Everyone in Redridge knew Caleb's name, even if they didn't know the man anymore. Caleb didn't respond. He walked straight to where Eliza knelt and extended his hand to her. She looked up at him, her eyes wide and dark and full of a hurt that had nothing to do with this particular moment. This was old hurt, the kind that accumulated like snowfall, layer upon layer, until you couldn't remember what the ground looked like underneath. "Ma'am," Caleb said quietly. For a long moment she just stared at his outstretched hand as if it might be a trick. Then slowly she took it. Her hand was cold even through his glove, and when he pulled her to her feet he felt how she trembled, not from fear, from exhaustion, the bone-deep weariness of someone who'd been fighting too long with no victories to show for it. Caleb turned to face the 3 young men. They'd spread out a little, no longer laughing, watching him with the wary calculation of people trying to figure out if they'd crossed a line. "Give her the basket," Caleb said. His voice was quiet, but it carried. It was the voice of a man who'd faced down grizzly bears and winter storms and men with worse intentions than these boys could imagine. It was the voice of someone who didn't make requests. He stated facts and let the world adjust accordingly. The stocky one holding the basket shifted his weight, glancing at his tall companion. "We were just having a bit of fun, Mr. Rourke," the tall one said. "No harm meant." "The basket," Caleb repeated. The stocky one lowered it slowly, then set it in the snow between them before stepping back. Caleb picked it up and handed it to Eliza. Then he bent down, his back protesting with a sharp twinge he ignored, and began gathering the scattered loaves of bread. "Mr. Rourke, that bread's ruined," the tall one said. "Snow got all over it." Caleb continued gathering the loaves, brushing snow off each one with careful attention. When all 6 were back in the basket, he straightened and looked at the 3 young men. "You have somewhere else to be," he said. It wasn't a question. The tall one's jaw tightened. For a moment, Caleb thought he might push back, might say something stupid that would force this confrontation into territory nobody wanted. But whatever the young man saw in Caleb's eyes made him think better of it. "Sure," he said, trying to salvage some dignity. "Come on, boys. Let's leave the old man to his charity work." They walked away, throwing glances back over their shoulders, their laughter hollow and forced now. Caleb watched until they disappeared around the corner of the trading post. Then he turned to Eliza. She stood with the basket clutched to her chest again, staring at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Gratitude, yes, but also confusion. And underneath both, something that looked like fear. The fear of someone waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the kindness to reveal itself as another form of cruelty. "Thank you," she said quietly. Her voice was soft, almost musical, at odds with everything else about her. Caleb nodded. "Where are you staying?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She hesitated, her eyes dropping to the basket. "Muller's stable, behind the bakery. He lets me sleep there in exchange for work." "The stable?" Caleb kept his voice neutral, but inside something twisted. The temperature hadn't risen above freezing in a week, and the nights dropped to brutal lows that could kill an unprepared person. "That where you've been all winter?" "It's not so bad," Eliza said quickly. "There's hay, and the horses keep it warmer than you'd think. I've got blankets." Caleb looked at her, really looked at her. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 25 or 30. Her face was round and plain, reddened by cold and marked by the kind of tiredness that went deeper than missing sleep. Her coat was thin, her boots worn down at the heels. The blankets she mentioned were probably just as inadequate as everything else. "Storm's coming," he said, glancing at the sky. The clouds were building again in the north, that particular shade of gray that promised heavy snow. "Be here by nightfall." "I'll be fine," Eliza said, but there was no conviction in it. Caleb thought about his warm cabin, his fireplace, the extra blankets he kept in the chest at the foot of his bed, the ones Margaret had made before she died. He thought about the deer he'd taken last week, the meat hanging in his cold shed, more than one person could eat before it went bad. He thought about walking away, going back to his supplies and his solitary life, letting this woman go back to a freezing stable with bread ruined by snow and boys who thought cruelty was entertainment. He thought about all of this in the space of 3 heartbeats. Then he heard himself say, "Come with me." Eliza's eyes widened. "What?" "To my cabin," Caleb said. "You can stay the winter. I've got space." The words hung between them in the frozen air, and Caleb felt a distant surprise at himself. He hadn't planned to say them, hadn't thought them through. They'd simply emerged, as if some part of him that he'd thought long dead had seized control of his mouth. "I can't," Eliza said immediately. People would talk. It wouldn't be proper." "People talk anyway," Caleb said. "And there's nothing proper about freezing to death in a stable." "I don't even know you." "Caleb Rourke." He touched the brim of his hat. "And I know you're Eliza Hartley. You work for Muller's Bakery, and you're too stubborn to admit when you need help. Now we're acquainted." A sound escaped her that might have been a laugh or might have been a sob. She pressed her hand into her mouth, her eyes bright. "Why?" she whispered. "Why would you do this?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, watching the clouds roll in from the north. Why indeed? Because he'd seen too many people die who didn't need to? Because those boys reminded him of everything he hated about the world? Because Margaret would have insisted on it, would have already been heating soup and preparing the spare room, and some part of him still heard her voice? Or maybe because he was tired. Tired of the silence. Tired of the waiting. Tired of pretending that his slow fade into nothing was noble or peaceful or anything other than the coward's way out. "Because it's going to be a long winter," he said finally. and no one should spend it alone. Eliza stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. "I'll need to get my things," she said. "I'll wait." She returned 20 minutes later carrying a canvas bag that couldn't have held more than 2 or 3 dresses and whatever else she'd managed to keep from a life that had clearly been unkind. Caleb took the bag without comment and slung it over his shoulder alongside his supplies. They walked out of Red Ridge together, the mountain man and the woman everyone looked down on, and if anyone watched them go, and Caleb was certain someone did, he didn't look back to see. The trail to his cabin wound through dense pine forest, steep and narrow, packed hard by his daily walks, but still treacherous with ice. Eliza struggled to keep up, unused to the terrain, her breathing coming hard and fast. Caleb slowed his pace without making it obvious, pointing out hazards and offering his hand at the steepest parts. She took it without hesitation now, and he felt again how cold she was, how thin her gloves were. "How long have you been in Red Ridge?" he asked, partly to distract her from the climb. 3 years, she said between breaths. "Came out from Ohio. My parents died, fever, and I had an aunt here. Or I thought I did." "What happened?" "She died the winter before I arrived." Eliza navigated around a fallen log. "No one thought to write and tell me. By then I'd spent everything I had getting here, so I just stayed." "No other family?" "None that wanted me." She said it matter-of-factly, without self-pity, the way you'd comment on the weather. "Muller gave me work because no one else would take a job for that little pay. The stable because he said I could scare away thieves better than a dog." Caleb felt his jaw tighten. "Muller's a bastard." "Muller's practical," Eliza corrected. "And he's not wrong. I'm not much to look at, and I'm not quick, and I eat more than a skinny girl would. Those are just facts." "Those boys back there were stating facts too, were they?" She was quiet for a moment. They were young and bored. People need someone to look down on, makes them feel bigger. "And you just accept that?" "What choice do I have?" Eliza stopped walking, turning to face him on the narrow trail. "I'm a fat orphan with no money and no prospects. I can't fight my way up. I can't charm my way up. I can only survive, Mr. Rourke, and survival means not making more enemies than I already have." The resignation in her voice hit Caleb harder than any anger would have. This was someone who'd stopped hoping for better, who'd trimmed her expectations down so far that a freezing stable counted as mercy. He knew that feeling. He lived it every day. "Well," he said gruffly, "you're not surviving in a stable anymore. At least not tonight." They continued walking. The cabin appeared through the trees like something from a memory, small and solid, smoke rising from the chimney in a thin gray line. Caleb had left the fire banked when he departed that morning, trusting it to last until his return. He led Eliza up the porch steps and pushed open the door. The interior was warmer than outside, but still cool, the fire reduced to embers. Caleb immediately went to the fireplace and began building it back up, adding kindling and then larger logs until flames caught and spread. Behind him, he heard Eliza set down her bag very carefully. "It's nice," she said softly. Caleb glanced around his cabin, trying to see it through her eyes. Nice seemed generous. It was clean and functional, nothing more. But compared to a stable, he supposed it might seem like a palace. "There's the bed," he said, gesturing to the narrow cot in the corner. "You'll take it. I'll make a bedroll by the fire." "I can't take your bed." "You can and you will." Caleb's tone left no room for argument. "I've slept on harder ground than this floor, and I'll sleep better knowing you're not frozen to death. That's the arrangement. Take it or leave it." Eliza opened her mouth, then closed it. Finally, she nodded. "There's a washing basin behind that curtain," Caleb continued, pointing to a corner he'd partitioned off. "Water pumps out back. I'll show you in the morning. Privy's about 30 yards east, marked with a lantern post. Don't go out after dark without telling me first. Wolves are active this time of year." "Wolves," Eliza repeated faintly. "Just don't wander off alone and you'll be fine." Caleb moved to his shelves and started pulling down supplies. "You hungry?" "I shouldn't be. I ate yesterday." He paused, a can of beans in his hand, and looked at her. "You ate yesterday, as in, that was the last time you had a meal." She didn't answer, but the way she looked away told him everything. Caleb set his jaw and reached for more supplies. Within 20 minutes, he had a simple stew going: venison, beans, dried carrots, a little salt. Nothing fancy, but it filled the cabin with a smell that made his own stomach growl. Eliza sat at the table, her hands folded in her lap, watching him work with an expression that cycled between disbelief and cautious hope. "I can help," she offered. "I should help." "You can help tomorrow," Caleb said. "Tonight you're a guest." When the stew was ready, he ladled it into 2 tin bowls and set one in front of her. She stared at it for a long moment before picking up the spoon. The first bite seemed to undo something in her. Her eyes closed, her shoulders sagged, and when she opened her eyes again, they were bright with unshed tears. "It's good," she whispered. Caleb grunted and focused on his own bowl. They ate in silence, and he pretended not to notice when she wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Outside, the promised storm arrived. Wind howled around the cabin, rattling the shutters. Snow began to fall, heavy and thick, visible through the window in the firelight. The temperature dropped, and Caleb added more wood to the fire. When the meal was finished, Eliza insisted on washing the bowls. Caleb let her, sensing she needed to feel useful. While she worked, he prepared his bedroll near the fire, blankets and a rolled coat for a pillow. It wasn't comfortable, but he'd meant what he said. He'd slept in worse places. "Mr. Rourke," Eliza said from across the cabin. He looked up. She stood by the bed, her hands twisting together. "I just want you to know. I'm grateful. More than I can say. And I promise I won't be a burden. I can cook and clean and mend. I can haul water and chop wood and—" "Eliza," Caleb interrupted gently. She stopped, looking at him with wide eyes. "You don't have to earn your place here," he said. "You're here because no one should freeze to death in a stable. That's all. Sleep. We'll figure out the rest tomorrow." She nodded slowly, then climbed into the bed fully clothed, pulling the blankets up to her chin. Within minutes, her breathing had slowed and deepened. Caleb sat by the fire for a long time after, watching the flames dance and listening to the storm rage outside. He thought about Margaret, about Thomas, about all the years he'd spent in this cabin alone. He thought about the look on Eliza's face when those boys had circled her, and the look when she'd tasted hot stew. He thought about second chances and whether a man his age had any right to them. But mostly, he thought about how strange it felt, frightening and exhilarating at once, to have another heartbeat in his home, another life depending on choices he made. The mountain man who'd believed his story was over had just written a new chapter, whether he'd meant to or not. And somewhere deep in his chest, beneath layers of grief and resignation and carefully constructed solitude, something that had been frozen for a very long time began, ever so slightly, to thaw. The storm raged for 3 more days, and neither Caleb nor Eliza could have known that by the time it cleared, both their lives would have changed in ways neither could have imagined. The first gray light of dawn found Caleb already awake, lying in his bedroll and staring at the ceiling beams. He'd slept poorly, his body unaccustomed to the hard floor despite his claims otherwise. But more than that, his mind had refused to settle. The presence of another person in his cabin, the soft sound of her breathing, the way the floorboards creaked when she shifted in sleep, had kept him alert through the long night, every sense heightened in a way he hadn't experienced in years. Eliza still slept, curled on her side beneath the blankets, one hand tucked under her cheek like a child. In sleep, the worry lines smoothed from her face, and Caleb could see that she was younger than he'd estimated. Maybe not even 30 yet, too young to carry the weight of resignation he'd seen in her eyes yesterday. He rose quietly and rebuilt the fire. The routine so familiar, his hands worked without conscious thought. The coffee pot went on to boil. He pulled on his coat and boots and stepped outside into a world transformed. The storm had buried everything under fresh snow, 3 feet at least, maybe more in the drifts. The sky had cleared to a pale, brittle blue, and the air was so cold it stung his lungs. Caleb made his way to the woodshed, his legs punching through the crust with each step, and loaded his arms with split logs. 2 trips to stock the cabin properly. By the time he returned from the second, Eliza was awake. She sat at the table in the same dress she'd worn yesterday, her hair hanging loose around her shoulders, watching him with those dark, cautious eyes. "Morning," Caleb said, stamping snow off his boots. "Good morning." Her voice was soft, uncertain. "I'm sorry I slept so long. I should have been up to start the fire." Fire started. Caleb hung his coat on the peg by the door. "Coffee's almost ready." "Still, I should have—" "Eliza." He turned to face her. You spent who knows how many nights half frozen in a stable. You needed the sleep. Let it be. She fell silent, her hands folding in her lap in that nervous gesture he was beginning to recognize. Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her, then settled into the other chair with his own. They drank in silence for a few minutes. The coffee was strong and bitter, the way Caleb liked it, and he saw Eliza's eyes widen at the first sip before she adapted to it. Storm's passed, he said finally, but we got 3 feet of new snow. Trail to town won't be passable for a few days at least. Something flickered across her face, fear maybe, or calculation. So I'm stuck here. We both are. Caleb studied her over the rim of his cup. That going to be a problem? I don't know. She met his eyes, and there was a directness in her gaze that surprised him. Is it going to be a problem for you, mister? Rourke, having a stranger in your home for days on end? It was a fair question, and Caleb considered it honestly. Was it a problem? Yes and no. His solitude had been comfortable, familiar, safe. This, her presence, the disruption to his routine, the simple fact of another human being sharing his space, felt dangerous in ways he couldn't articulate. But dangerous didn't necessarily mean wrong. Call me Caleb, he said. And no, it's not a problem. Eliza's shoulders relaxed fractionally. Then we should figure out how this is going to work. Already told you. You take the bed, I'll sleep by the fire. You don't owe me anything beyond being respectful of the space. That's not fair to you. Life's not fair. Caleb drained his coffee and stood. You want fair, you picked the wrong world. Now, you said you could cook? Yes? Good. Because I'm tired of my own cooking. You handle meals, I'll handle firewood and water. We'll trade off on cleaning. That sound reasonable? Eliza blinked, clearly having expected some different arrangement. That sounds reasonable. Yes. Then let's see what we can make for breakfast. The supplies were simple: cornmeal, eggs from the 3 chickens he kept in a sheltered coop, a bit of salt pork. But Eliza's hands moved with practiced efficiency as she worked, transforming basic ingredients into cornbread and fried eggs that actually had flavor. Caleb watched her without seeming to, noting how she'd found the skillet without asking, how she knew to test the heat with a drop of water, how she plated the food with care despite the rough tin dishes. You're good at this, he said as they ate. She ducked her head, color rising in her cheeks. My mother taught me. Before she died. She said a woman who could cook would never starve. She was right about that. She was wrong about a lot of other things. Eliza pushed eggs around her plate. She said hard work and virtue would be rewarded. That kindness mattered more than beauty. That people were fundamentally decent if you gave them a chance. You don't believe that? I've given people plenty of chances, Eliza said quietly. And what I've learned is that people are decent when it costs them nothing. When decency requires sacrifice, most choose themselves. Caleb thought about the young men in the town square, about Mueller and his freezing stable, about everyone in Redridge who'd seen this woman struggling and looked away. He thought about himself, too. The 15 years he'd spent in this cabin, helping no one, connecting with no one, so wrapped up in his own grief that the world beyond his door might as well not have existed. Can't argue with that, he said. They cleaned up together, falling into a rhythm that felt oddly natural. Eliza washed while Caleb dried and put away. When they finished, he showed her around the cabin properly, the water pump out back that required priming in cold weather, the root cellar where he stored potatoes and carrots and preserved meat, the shed where he kept his traps and tools. It's a good setup, Eliza said, surveying the orderly arrangement. You're self-sufficient out here. Have to be. Town's too far for daily trips, especially in winter. Caleb pulled down a set of traps from their hooks. I check my trap line every few days. Beaver mostly, some marten. Furs to sell come spring. Can I come with you next time you check them? He glanced at her in surprise. It's cold work, wet and miserable. I've done cold work before. Her chin lifted slightly. And I'd like to learn. If something happened to you, I should know where the traps are. It was practical thinking, the kind that came from hard experience. Caleb found himself nodding. All right, day after tomorrow, if the weather holds. The days began to take on a pattern. Caleb rose first each morning, built up the fire, started the coffee. Eliza woke soon after and took over breakfast while he handled the outdoor chores, feeding the chickens, hauling water, splitting wood. They ate together, then divided the day's work between them. Eliza cleaned the cabin with a thoroughness it hadn't seen in years, scrubbing the floors and walls, washing the windows until they let in more light than Caleb remembered. She mended his clothes, darning holes in his socks and replacing buttons with such neat stitches they were almost invisible. She reorganized his shelves, grouping like items together in a way that actually made sense. Caleb, for his part, found himself doing things he'd let slide for years. He repaired the loose board on the porch steps, fixed the shutter that had hung crooked since last winter, even built a second chair for the table, working in the shed during the afternoons while Eliza prepared dinner. They talked while they worked, tentative conversations at first, testing the waters of shared space. Caleb learned that Eliza could read, her mother had taught her, and that she'd once dreamed of being a teacher, that she loved thunderstorms but feared deep water, that she'd never tasted chocolate or seen the ocean or owned a dress that was made specifically for her. Eliza learned that Caleb had been married for 12 years before Margaret died, that his son Thomas had been a serious boy who'd loved books more than hunting, which had confused Caleb until he'd stopped trying to understand and just accepted it. That Caleb had once tracked a lost child for 3 days through a blizzard and brought her home alive, though he'd lost 2 toes to frostbite in the process. "Do you miss it?" Eliza asked one afternoon. They were sitting by the fire, Eliza mending one of Caleb's shirts while he carved spoons from birch wood. The tracking, being the man everyone counted on. Caleb's knife stilled against the wood. "I don't know. Maybe. Mostly I miss feeling like I mattered." "You matter now. To who?" The question came out sharper than he'd intended. "I'm an old man living in the woods waiting to die. That's not mattering. That's just taking up space." Eliza's hand stopped moving. "You matter to me." The words hung between them, simple and devastating. Caleb looked up from his carving to find her watching him with an intensity that made his chest tight. "You saved my life," she continued quietly. "Not from the boys in town, from everything else. From freezing, from giving up, from believing that cold and hunger and loneliness were all I deserved. You matter, Caleb Rourke, whether you believe it or not." He wanted to argue, to deflect, to retreat into the comfortable bitterness he'd worn for so long, but something about the way she said his name, not Mr. Rourke, but Caleb, like he was a person and not just a title, stopped the words in his throat. "You're not what I expected," he said instead. "What did you expect?" "Someone broken. Someone who needed saving." Caleb returned to his carving, the knife moving again in steady strokes. "But you're not broken, are you? Just bent. There's a difference." Eliza smiled, small and sad. "I think we're both a little bent. Maybe that's all right." "Maybe it is." On the 3rd day, Caleb took Eliza out to check his trap line. The temperature had risen slightly, only 10 below instead of 20, and the sun turned the snow into a field of diamonds. They walked single file through the forest, Caleb breaking trail and Eliza following in his footsteps, carrying the canvas sack for whatever they found. The first 3 traps were empty, the bait taken by some clever creature that had avoided the spring. The 4th held a beaver, frozen solid. Caleb reset the trap with practiced efficiency while Eliza watched, asking questions about placement and bait and how to read animal signs in the snow. "You're a quick study," he said as they moved to the 5th trap. "I had to be. Quick learners survive longer." She pointed to a set of tracks crossing their path. "What are those?" "Elk, moving down from the high country looking for easier forage." Caleb studied the prints. "Big bull, probably. See how deep they are? Could you track him?" "Could. Why?" Eliza shrugged, but there was something calculating in her expression. "You said you were tired of beaver. Elk would give us meat for weeks." "It would," Caleb agreed, "but tracking in this snow would take most of a day. Maybe 2. I'm not afraid of long days." He looked at her, really looked at her. The cold had brought color to her cheeks, and her eyes were bright with interest rather than resignation. She stood straighter out here, he realized, moved with more confidence. The woman who'd knelt in the town square seemed like a different person from the one standing beside him now. "All right," Caleb heard himself say. "Tomorrow. We'll go after him." They returned to the cabin with 3 beavers and a marten, enough to make the trip worthwhile. Eliza helped him skin and clean the animals, her stomach stronger than he'd expected, her hands steady with the knife. That night over dinner, venison stew with the last of the potatoes, Caleb found himself talking about Margaret. "She would have liked you," he said abruptly. Eliza paused, her spoon halfway to her mouth. "Your wife?" "Margaret. She was—" Caleb struggled for words. "She saw people. Really saw them, you know. Not what they looked like or what they could do for her. Who they were underneath. She would have taken one look at you and known what I'm just figuring out." "What's that?" "That you're stronger than you think you are." Eliza set down her spoon very carefully. "I don't feel strong." "Strength isn't about feeling. It's about doing." Caleb gestured at the cabin around them. "You could have given up in that stable. Let the cold take you. Instead, you kept going. That's strength. Or stubbornness. Same thing most times." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her face. "Margaret sounds like she was remarkable." "She was." Caleb's voice went rough. "Lost her to fever. 16 years ago this past October. Watched her die over 3 days and couldn't do a damn thing to stop it. I'm sorry." "So was I. Still am most days." He pushed the stew around his bowl. "My boy, Thomas, he couldn't understand why I didn't move on. Thought I was being selfish, holding on to grief like it was something precious. Maybe he was right. Maybe that's exactly what I was doing." "Grief isn't selfish," Eliza said quietly. "It's just love with nowhere to go." The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. He'd never heard it put that way before, but the truth of it resonated in his chest like a bell struck hard. "Where'd you learn that?" he asked. "Living." She met his eyes across the table. "And losing. Grief's the only thing I've got more experience with than cooking." They fell silent after that, but it was a comfortable silence, the kind that didn't need filling. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the eaves, but inside the cabin was warm and bright, the fire casting dancing shadows on the walls. Caleb stood and retrieved something from the chest at the foot of the bed, a folded quilt in shades of blue and cream, the stitching intricate and perfect. "Margaret made this," he said, holding it out to Eliza. "It's been sitting in that chest since she died. Seems wrong to keep it locked away when it could be keeping someone warm." Eliza's hands trembled as she took the quilt, unfolding it carefully. "Caleb, I can't. It's a quilt, and quilts are meant to be used." He kept his voice gruff to hide the emotion underneath. "She'd want someone to have it. Might as well be you." Eliza pressed the fabric to her face, and when she lowered it, her eyes were wet. "Thank you." That night, Caleb lay in his bedroll by the fire and listened to the wind. But beneath the wind, he heard something else. Eliza crying, very quietly, into Margaret's quilt. Not sad crying, he thought. Something else. Relief, maybe. Or gratitude. Or just the release of tension that came from finally, briefly, being safe. He pretended to be asleep and let her have her tears in private. The elk hunt began at dawn. They packed light, water, dried meat, extra powder for Caleb's rifle, and set out into the cold following the tracks from yesterday. The bull had moved northeast, working his way along a ridgeline where the snow was thinner. Caleb taught as they walked, pointing out sign, a scraped tree where the elk had rubbed its antlers, droppings that were less than a day old, beds in the snow where the animal had rested. Eliza absorbed it all with fierce concentration, asking questions that showed she was thinking 3 steps ahead. "You're a natural at this," Caleb said as they paused to rest at midday. "I'm just paying attention." "That's what makes a natural." He passed her the water skin. "Most people look without seeing. You see?" They found the elk 2 hours later, bedded down in a hollow sheltered by deadfall timber. A magnificent bull with antlers that spread 6 feet across, his breath steaming in the frozen air. Caleb lined up the shot, breathing slow and steady, the rifle familiar against his shoulder. He squeezed the trigger, and the crack of the gunshot echoed across the valley. The bull went down clean, dead before it knew what happened. A good death, as deaths went. The work of field dressing and quartering the animal took the rest of the afternoon. It was brutal, bloody work, and Caleb kept expecting Eliza to turn away or grow faint. Instead, She rolled up her sleeves and helped, following his instructions on how to separate the joints, which cuts to take, how to pack the meat into the canvas bags they'd brought. "My hands are shaking," she said at one point, looking down at her blood-stained fingers. "Mine too. It's the cold." Caleb handed her a rag. "You're doing good work." By the time they'd finished, dusk was falling. They'd taken everything they could carry, close to 80 pounds of prime meat, and marked the location to return for the rest with a sled. The walk back to the cabin was slow and exhausted. The meat was heavy, and both of them were running on empty. But there was a satisfaction in it, too, the kind of tiredness that came from honest work and success. They were halfway home when Caleb felt his back seize. It happened without warning. One moment he was walking fine, the next his entire lower back locked up in a spasm of pain so intense it drove him to his knees in the snow. "Caleb!" Eliza dropped her pack and was beside him instantly. "What happened?" "My back," he managed through gritted teeth, "threw it out." He'd felt it coming all afternoon, the warning twinges that said he was pushing too hard, lifting too much weight. But he'd ignored it, because what else could he do? The work needed doing, and he was the only one who could do it. Except now he couldn't do anything except kneel in the snow and try to breathe through the pain. "Can you stand?" Eliza asked. "Don't know. Maybe." He tried to push himself up and collapsed again with a sound that was half gasp, half cry. The pain was blinding, radiating down his legs and up his spine. "All right, don't move." Eliza's voice was calm, practical, the same tone she'd used when asking about trap placement. "We're a mile from the cabin." "About that." "Can you make it if I help you?" "The meat. Damn the meat." Her voice was sharp. "We can come back for it tomorrow. Right now we need to get you inside and warm." She was right, much as Caleb hated to admit it. The temperature was dropping fast, and if he stayed out here immobile, he'd freeze. Better to lose the meat than both their lives. Eliza got her shoulder under his arm and helped him to his feet. The pain was excruciating, but with her support, he could shuffle forward in small, agonizing steps. She took almost all his weight, her body solid and strong beside him, never wavering even when he stumbled. It took 2 hours to cover the mile back to the cabin, 2 hours of pain and cold, and the humiliating awareness that he'd failed, that his body had betrayed him at the worst possible moment. By the time they reached the door, Caleb was drenched in sweat despite the cold, every muscle trembling with exhaustion. Eliza got him inside and lowered him onto the bed, his bed, the one he'd insisted she take. "I'll get the fire going," she said, already moving. "Don't try to get up." Caleb didn't argue. He couldn't have moved if his life depended on it. He watched through a haze of pain as Eliza took charge with quick efficiency. Fire built high, water heating. She helped him out of his coat and boots, her hands gentle but sure, then brought him water and made him drink. "There's willow bark," he said. "In the tin on the second shelf. For the pain." She found it and brewed it into a bitter tea that he forced down. The pain didn't vanish, but it dulled to something manageable. "I'm going to check your back," Eliza said. "Tell me if anything I do makes it worse." Her hands were warm and careful as she felt along his spine, finding the knotted muscles and working them gently. It hurt, but it was the good kind of hurt, the kind that meant healing. "You've done this before," Caleb said. "My father had a bad back, worked the fields too hard when he was young, and it never forgave him." Her fingers pressed into a particularly tight spot, and Caleb hissed, "Mother taught me how to help." She worked on him for nearly an hour, and by the time she finished, the worst of the spasm had released. He still couldn't stand without help, but he could breathe without agony, and that was something. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You carried the meat most of the way," Eliza pointed out. "I just carried you the last mile. We're even." "We're not even close to even." She smiled and went to prepare dinner, a simple soup from dried stores since the fresh meat was still out in the forest somewhere. They ate with Caleb propped up in bed, and afterward Eliza made her bedroll by the fire without being asked. "This is backwards," Caleb protested. "You should have the bed." "You can't sleep on the floor with your back like this, and we both know it." She settled into the blankets with the finality of someone who'd made up her mind. "Besides, I've slept in worse places, remember?" Caleb wanted to argue, but the pain and exhaustion were catching up with him. His eyes grew heavy, and the last thing he saw before sleep claimed him was Eliza sitting by the fire, wrapped in Margaret's quilt, keeping watch. The next 3 days were some of the most frustrating of Caleb's life. His back improved slowly, but any attempt to do serious work sent fresh spasms through his spine. He was trapped in the cabin, dependent on Eliza for everything from cooking to firewood to fetching water. She handled it all without complaint, rising early and working late, keeping the cabin warm and both of them fed. On the second day, she took the sled and returned to where they'd left the elk meat, retrieving it in multiple trips rather than risk loading too much weight at once. "I'm useless," Caleb said on the third evening, watching her hang strips of venison to dry near the fire. "You're healing," Eliza corrected. There's a difference. "I should be the one doing this, the heavy work. That's the arrangement." "The arrangement is that we both do what we can." She wiped her hands on her apron and came to sit beside the bed. "Right now, I can do the heavy work. When your back heals, you'll do it again. That's how partnership works." "Partnership," Caleb repeated. "What else would you call it?" Eliza met his eyes. "We're sharing this space, sharing the work, sharing our lives, at least for now. That's partnership." "For now," Caleb echoed. The words felt heavier than they should have. "What happens when spring comes? When the trail's clear and you can go back to town?" Eliza was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know," she said finally. "Do you want me to go?" It was the question Caleb had been avoiding asking himself. Did he want her to go? A month ago, the answer would have been obvious. He'd wanted to be alone, needed it the way some men needed whiskey or company. Solitude had been his refuge, his fortress, his slow path to nothing. But now, watching Eliza in the firelight, seeing how she'd transformed his cabin from a waiting room for death into something that felt almost like a home, the answer wasn't simple anymore. "No," he admitted. "I don't want you to go." The smile that spread across her face was like sunrise after a long night. "Good, because I don't want to go either." That night, Caleb's back felt better than it had in days. And when he finally slept, he dreamed not of the past, but of a future that stretched beyond the next day, the next week, the next storm. A future that included laughter and shared work and someone who called him by his name instead of his title. A future that, for the first time in 15 years, he actually wanted to see. Winter deepened its hold on Red Ridge Valley, and with it came a transformation neither Caleb nor Eliza could have predicted. The cabin that had once been a monument to solitude became something else entirely. A place where two people learned to exist not just alongside each other, but because of each other. Caleb's back healed slowly over the following weeks, the muscles gradually releasing their angry grip. Eliza's patient care and willingness to shoulder the heavy work allowed him to rest properly for the first time in years, and he found himself mending faster than expected. By the end of the second week, he could walk without wincing. By the third, he was back to checking trap lines, though Eliza insisted on coming with him. "You're not carrying a full pack yet," she said one morning as they prepared to head out. "And if something happens, someone needs to be there who isn't flat on their back in the snow." "You saying I'm old and fragile?" Caleb tried to sound gruff, but there was no heat in it. "I'm saying you're stubborn and recovering." Eliza wrapped a thick scarf around her neck, one she'd knitted herself from wool Caleb had traded for years ago and never used. "There's a difference." They fell into new rhythms. Caleb taught Eliza everything he knew about surviving in the mountains, how to read weather signs in the clouds, how to find water beneath snow, how to tell poisonous plants from edible ones come spring. She absorbed it all with the same fierce attention she'd shown from the beginning, and Caleb found himself taking pride in her progress, the way he'd once taken pride in Thomas's first successful hunt. Eliza, for her part, brought order and warmth to places that had gone cold and chaotic. She organized Caleb's tools so he could find what he needed without searching. She mended not just the tears in his clothes, but the missing buttons, the worn cuffs, the hem that had come undone on his winter coat and dragged in the snow for 3 years. Small things, perhaps, but they added up to a life that felt cared for instead of merely endured. One evening in late January, as they sat by the fire after supper, Eliza pulled out a piece of cloth she'd been working on for days. "What's that?" Caleb asked, looking up from the leather he was stitching into new gloves. "A shirt." She held it up for his inspection. "For you. Your others are wearing thin, and I thought—" She trailed off, suddenly uncertain, and Caleb saw the vulnerability in her face. She'd made him something spent her evenings cutting and sewing when she could have been resting, creating something new instead of just mending the old. "It's good work," he said quietly, taking the shirt and examining the stitching. It was better than good. It was expert, the seams straight and strong, the collar properly fitted. "Thank you." "You don't have to wear it if you don't want to. I just thought, I'll wear it." Caleb met her eyes. "Tomorrow, and I'll be grateful for it." The smile that lit her face was worth more than all the furs he'd trapped that winter. But not everything was peaceful harmony. There were moments of friction, times when the reality of two people living in close quarters scraped against old wounds and ingrained habits. It came to a head one afternoon when Caleb returned from checking traps to find Eliza reorganizing his shelves again. This time moving the medical supplies he kept in careful order. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharper than intended. Eliza turned, a tin of salve in her hand. "Reorganizing. Half of this stuff was expired and the rest was scattered. I had a system. You had chaos." She set the tin down firmly. "Medicine on the left, bandages in the middle, tinctures on the right. That way if something happens we can find what we need quickly instead of hunting through 3 different shelves." It was fine the way it was. "It was a mess, Caleb." Her voice rose to match his. "And I know you hate change. I know you've had everything exactly the same way for years, but that doesn't mean it's the best way. Sometimes things need to change." "You're talking about more than shelves." "Maybe I am." Eliza crossed her arms. "You've spent 15 years treating this cabin like a tomb. Everything preserved exactly as it was. Nothing moved, nothing changed. Like if you just kept it all frozen in place, time would stop and you wouldn't have to face the fact that life goes on." The words hit like a slap. Caleb felt his jaw tighten, anger rising hot and defensive. "You don't know what you're talking about." "Don't I?" Eliza stepped closer, her eyes blazing. "I've been here almost 2 months, Caleb. 2 months of watching you flinch every time something changes. That quilt I'm using, you kept it locked in a chest for 16 years rather than let anyone else touch it. These shelves, this furniture, the way you make your coffee, it's all exactly like it was when Margaret was alive, isn't it? Down to the smallest detail." "So what if it is?" Caleb's voice was rough with emotion he couldn't contain. "So what if I want to keep some things the same? Is that such a crime?" "It is when it means you're not living." Eliza's voice softened, but her words were no less cutting. "You're existing, Caleb, going through the motions. But living? Actually living? That requires letting go of what was and making room for what could be. Like you have?" The moment the words left his mouth, Caleb regretted them. But they were out now, and there was no taking them back. "You're no better than me. You spent 3 years sleeping in a stable rather than fight for something better. At least I had the excuse of grief. What's yours?" Eliza's face went pale, then red. For a moment, Caleb thought she might cry or shout or storm out into the snow. Instead, she laughed, a bitter, broken sound that held no humor. "You're right," she said quietly. "I gave up. I accepted that I was worthless because everyone told me I was, and it was easier to believe them than to fight. But you know what the difference is between us?" "What?" "I'm trying to change." Eliza's voice was steady now, controlled. "I came here broken, and I'm trying to put myself back together. You came here broken, and you're trying to stay that way. So yes, maybe we're both cowards, but at least I'm working on it." She turned and walked to the door, pulling on her coat. "Where are you going?" Caleb demanded. "For a walk. I need air. It's almost dark, the temperature's dropping. Then I guess we'll see if I'm as helpless as everyone thinks." She pulled the door open, letting in a blast of cold air. "Don't worry, I'll be back before I freeze to death. Wouldn't want to mess up your careful system by dying on your porch." The door slammed shut behind her. Caleb stood in the sudden silence, his heart pounding, anger and shame warring in his chest. He wanted to go after her, to apologize, to take back the cruel words, but pride held him in place, that stubborn, stupid pride that had kept him isolated for 15 years. He looked at the reorganized shelves, at the neat rows of supplies that he could now see made perfect sense. Then he looked at the rest of the cabin, the bed positioned exactly where Margaret had wanted it, the table at the precise angle she'd preferred, the curtain hung the way she'd hung it 16 years ago. Eliza was right. He'd turned this place into a shrine, and in doing so, he'd trapped himself in amber. The mountain man who'd once faced down grizzly bears was afraid of moving a shelf. The realization settled over him like snow, cold and inescapable. He was still standing there 20 minutes later when Eliza returned, her cheeks red from cold, her eyes bright with unshed tears. She hung up her coat without looking at him and went to the fire, holding her hands out to warm them. "I'm sorry," Caleb said. She didn't turn around. "For which part?" "All of it. What I said about you. What I implied." He moved closer, stopping a few feet behind her. "You're not worthless, Eliza. You never were. And you're right about me. About all of it." "I shouldn't have pushed." Her voice was small. "This is your home. I had no right." "You had every right." Caleb took a breath. "You live here too. And you're right. I've been keeping everything frozen because I was afraid. Afraid that if I changed anything, I'd lose what little I had left of her. Of them. Of the man I used to be." Eliza turned to face him then, and the understanding in her eyes nearly undid him. "But the thing is," Caleb continued, "I already lost them. Holding on to their ghosts isn't bringing them back. It's just keeping me from living, like you said. And maybe it's time I stopped waiting to die and figured out how to live again." "I don't want you to forget her," Eliza said quietly. "I would never ask that." "I know, but there's a difference between remembering someone and refusing to let them go." Caleb gestured at the cabin. "This place, it needs to be a home for the living, not a museum for the dead. So if you want to reorganize the shelves, or move the furniture, or change anything else, you do it. Make this place yours too." "Ours," Eliza corrected softly. "Not mine. Ours." The word hung in the air between them, full of implications neither was quite ready to examine, but it felt right in a way that scared and exhilarated Caleb in equal measure. "Ours," he agreed. They didn't embrace or make grand declarations. They simply stood there in the firelight, two wounded people acknowledging that they were healing together, and that maybe that was enough. The next morning, Caleb woke to find Eliza already up, rearranging the furniture. The table had moved 6 inches to the left, angled to catch more light from the window. The chair, both chairs now, sat at different positions. The bed was still in the same place, but she'd added a small shelf beside it for books and a water glass. "What do you think?" she asked when she saw him watching. Caleb looked around the cabin, seeing it with fresh eyes. It looked different, unfamiliar, and that was exactly the point. "I think it's better," he said. Over the following weeks, the cabin continued to transform. Eliza made curtains from fabric Caleb traded for at his next trip to town, a short journey now that his back had healed and the trails were passable again. She hung dried herbs from the rafters, filling the air with the scent of sage and thyme. She convinced Caleb to build a proper shelf for books. Neither of them had many, but the ones they did have deserved better than being stacked in a corner. Caleb, for his part, began projects he'd put off for years. He expanded the chicken coop, adding space for more birds come spring. He reinforced the shed and built a proper rack for drying furs. He even started work on a second room, a small addition to the cabin that would give them each some privacy. "You don't have to do that," Eliza said when she saw him measuring lumber. "I want to." Caleb marked a cut line with careful precision. "You've been sleeping by the fire for months. You deserve a real bed in a real room." "Where will you sleep?" "The main room's big enough for 2 beds if we arrange them right." He looked up at her. "Unless you'd rather have complete privacy." "Then I can sleep in the addition." Eliza considered this, her head tilted. "I think I'd rather we both stayed in the main room. I've gotten used to not being alone." "Me too," Caleb admitted. The addition took 3 weeks to build, working mostly in the afternoons when the day's other chores were done. It wasn't large, maybe 10 feet by 12, but it had a window that looked east toward the mountains and enough space for storage and a small workshop where Caleb could work on projects during bad weather. The day they finished it, Eliza insisted on cooking something special for dinner. She'd been saving ingredients for weeks, a bit of flour here, some sugar there, precious cinnamon she'd convinced the trader to part with at enormous cost. "What are you making?" Caleb asked, watching her work with bemused curiosity. "Apple cake, or something close to it." She mixed ingredients with fierce concentration. "My mother used to make it for special occasions. I probably won't get it right, but I thought we should celebrate. Celebrate what? Eliza paused, her hands dusted with flour, and looked at him with an expression that was half smile, half something deeper. Having a home, both of us. The cake was lopsided and slightly burned on one edge, but it was the best thing Caleb had tasted in years. They ate it by the fire, talking late into the night about everything and nothing, childhood memories, dreams they'd abandoned, small hopes for the future. What did you want to be? Eliza asked at one point. Before all this? Before Margaret? Before Thomas? Before you became the legendary tracker? What did young Caleb Rourke dream about? No one had asked him that question in 30 years. Caleb had to reach back through decades of accumulated experience to find the boy he'd been. A builder, he said finally. I wanted to build things. Houses, mostly. I liked the idea of creating something that would last, something that would shelter people long after I was gone. You did build something, Eliza gestured at the cabin around them. This, the addition, you're still that person. Maybe. Caleb smiled slightly. What about you? You said you wanted to be a teacher. I did. I wanted to teach children to read, to write, to think. She stared into the fire. I thought if I could give them knowledge, I could give them choices, opportunities I never had. Why can't you still? I'm 32 years old, Caleb, living in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. Who would I teach? The children in Red Ridge, the settlement kids who don't have proper schooling. Caleb leaned forward, the idea taking shape as he spoke. You could do it. Come spring, when people are around more. A few hours a week, teaching reading and numbers. They wouldn't want me. You're educated and patient and kind, Caleb interrupted firmly. And anyone who's too stupid to see that doesn't deserve your time. But there are good people in Red Ridge, too. People who jump at the chance to give their children real learning. Eliza looked at him with wonder and fear in equal measure. You really think I could? I know you could. She didn't commit to it that night, but Caleb could see the idea taking root. He recognized the look in her eyes. He'd seen it in the mirror recently, that cautious, terrified hope that maybe the future held more than just survival. February brought a thaw that turned the valley into a slushy mess, followed by a cold snap that froze everything solid again. The ice made travel treacherous, but it also created beauty. The trees encased in crystal, the creek frozen into fantastic shapes, the world transformed into something magical and temporary. Caleb and Eliza walked through it one afternoon, checking the trap lines together as had become their habit. The work went faster with two people, and Caleb had long since admitted to himself that he simply enjoyed her company. Look at that, Eliza breathed, stopping at a frozen waterfall. The water had stopped mid-cascade, creating a sculpture of ice that caught the afternoon light and threw it back in rainbow fragments. It's something, Caleb agreed. It's beautiful. She moved closer, examining the patterns in the ice. All that motion, all that power, just frozen in time, like a moment captured. It'll melt come spring. I know, but right now, right this second, it's perfect. She turned to look at him. Don't you think that's enough? To have something perfect for just a moment, even knowing it won't last? Caleb understood she wasn't really talking about ice. Yeah, he said quietly. I think that's enough. They stood there together in the cold, watching light play across frozen water, and Caleb felt something shift in his chest. It wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was gentle, inevitable, like snow settling on pine branches. He was falling in love with Eliza Hartley. The realization should have terrified him, should have sent him retreating back into the safe numbness he'd cultivated for 15 years. But instead, it settled over him with a strange sense of rightness, as if some part of him had known for weeks and was only now allowing his conscious mind to catch up. He didn't say anything. The moment felt too fragile, too new. But walking back to the cabin with Eliza beside him, their breath steaming in the cold air, Caleb felt something he'd thought died with Margaret. He felt alive. That night, unable to sleep, Caleb rose from his bed and went to the small workshop in the addition. He lit a lantern and pulled out a piece of birchwood he'd been saving, smooth and pale, perfect for carving. He worked through the night, his hands moving with the muscle memory of decades. The knife cut smooth and sure, shaving away everything that wasn't the image in his mind. By dawn, he had finished. A small bench, no bigger than his palm, carved from a single piece of wood, simple and clean, with 2 letters carved into the seat, C+E. He held it in his hands as the first light filtered through the window, examining his work with critical eyes. It wasn't much, just a piece of wood with 2 letters. But those letters represented something he hadn't dared to hope for in 15 years. A future, a partnership, a promise that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't finished with life after all. Caleb heard Eliza stirring in the main room. He stood, tucking the small bench into his pocket, and went to start the coffee. She emerged from behind the curtain a few minutes later, her hair loose around her shoulders, wearing the simple dress she slept in and wrapped in Margaret's quilt against the morning chill. "You're up early," she said, stifling a yawn. "Couldn't sleep." Caleb poured coffee into 2 cups. "Lots on my mind." "Want to talk about it?" Did he? Caleb turned the question over in his mind. What would he even say? That he'd realized he was in love with her? That the thought of spring coming and her potentially leaving made his chest tight with fear? That somewhere in the last 3 months she'd become essential to him in ways he was only beginning to understand? "Not yet," he said finally, "but maybe soon." Eliza nodded, accepting this with the patience she showed for everything. They drank their coffee in comfortable silence as the cabin warmed and the day began in earnest. Later that morning, Caleb made his decision. He went to the workshop and retrieved the carved bench, then found Eliza in the main room mending one of his shirts by the window where the light was best. "I made something for you," he said without preamble. She looked up, surprised. "For me?" Caleb held out the small bench. Eliza set down her mending and took it carefully, turning it over in her hands, examining the smooth wood and the carved letters. C+E, she read softly. Her eyes lifted to his, wide and questioning. "What does this mean?" "It means I don't want you to leave when spring comes." The words came out rougher than Caleb intended, but they were true. "It means these last few months, they've been the best I've had in 15 years. It means you matter to me, Eliza, more than I know how to say." Eliza's hands trembled on the small bench. "Caleb, I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he continued quickly. "I know this is sudden. I know I'm an old man with more past than future. But I needed you to know how I feel. That you're not just someone sharing my cabin. You're home." A single tear slid down Eliza's cheek, then another. But she was smiling, that beautiful smile that transformed her whole face. "I don't want to leave either," she whispered. "I haven't wanted to leave for weeks. I've been terrified you'd ask me to go." "Never." Caleb moved closer, taking her hand, the one not holding the carved bench. "You belong here, Eliza. With me. If you want to." "I want to." Her voice was stronger now, certain. "I want to stay. I want to build a life here. With you." Caleb felt something break open in his chest. 15 years of ice and isolation cracking apart to make room for warmth and connection. He pulled Eliza to her feet and wrapped his arms around her, and she came willingly, the carved bench pressed between them. They stood like that for a long moment, holding each other in the morning light, 2 broken people who'd somehow managed to put each other back together. "We're going to have to tell people," Eliza said eventually, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "In town. They'll talk." "Let them talk." Caleb pulled back enough to look at her face. "I'm done hiding, done waiting for life to end. If they want to judge us, that's their problem. Some of them will be cruel. Some of them already are." He touched her cheek gently. "But there are good people too, and the ones who matter will understand." Eliza nodded, then looked down at the small bench still clutched in her hand. "This is the most beautiful thing anyone's ever made for me." "Then I'll make you more," Caleb promised. "A whole house full of beautiful things. Whatever you want." "I just want this." She pressed the bench to her heart. "And you, that's enough." Outside, the ice began to melt, water running in small streams through the snow. Winter was loosening its grip, and with the coming thaw, everything would change. But inside the cabin, in the warmth of new promises and old dreams reborn, Caleb Rourke and Eliza Hartley held each other and dared to imagine a future neither had believed possible. The mountain man who'd thought his life was over had found a reason to live again. And the woman everyone looked down on had found someone who saw her worth. Together, they discovered that second chances weren't just for the young or the fortunate. Sometimes they came to broken people in broken places, arriving like spring after a brutal winter, tentative and fragile, but full of impossible hope. Spring arrived in Red Ridge Valley with reluctant grace, the snow retreating inch by stubborn inch up the mountainsides. The creek swelled with meltwater, running fast and cold, and the first green shoots pushed through the muddy earth like promises kept. The world was waking up, and with it came a reckoning that Caleb and Eliza could no longer avoid. They made the trip to town together on a morning in early March, walking side by side down the trail that had become as familiar to Eliza as it had always been to Caleb. She wore a new dress she'd sewn herself from fabric Caleb had traded for, simple gray wool, but well-fitted and clean. Her hair was braided and pinned, and though her hands twisted nervously in front of her, she walked with her head high. "You don't have to do this," Caleb said for the third time that morning. "We could wait, or I could go alone." "We're doing this together." Eliza's voice was steady despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "You said you were done hiding. So am I." Red Ridge looked different in the early spring light, the buildings emerging from snow like ships from fog. Smoke rose from chimneys, and people moved through the muddy streets conducting the business of survival, hauling water, chopping wood, trading goods at the general store. The first person to see them was Mrs. Henderson, the blacksmith's wife, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who knew everyone's business and made it her mission to share it. She stopped in the middle of the street, a basket of laundry balanced on her hip, and stared. "Mr. Rourke," she said carefully. "Miss Hartley, didn't expect to see you two together." "Morning, Catherine." Caleb touched the brim of his hat. "Fine day." "Is it?" Her eyes darted between them, calculating. "Haven't seen Miss Hartley in town since winter set in, I suppose." "I've been staying at Mr. Rourke's cabin," Eliza said clearly. "He offered me shelter during the storms." "Did he now?" Mrs. Henderson's tone suggested volumes of judgment packed into 3 words. How generous. "It was the decent thing to do," Caleb said, his voice taking on an edge. "Woman shouldn't have to freeze in a stable when there's a warm cabin available." "No, I suppose not." Mrs. Henderson shifted her basket, though some might wonder about the propriety of such an arrangement. "Then some should mind their own business." Caleb met her eyes steadily. "Anything else you need to say, Catherine?" The woman's mouth compressed into a thin line. "No, I suppose not. Good day to you both." She hurried off, and Caleb could practically see her planning which neighbor to tell first. By nightfall, everyone in Red Ridge would know that Caleb Rourke and Eliza Hartley had spent the winter together. The gossip would spread like wildfire through dry timber. "Well," Eliza said quietly, "that went about as expected." "First of many." Caleb took her elbow gently. "Come on, let's get our business done." They went to the general store first, where old Murphy behind the counter raised his eyebrows but kept his comments to himself. Caleb bought supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, ammunition, while Eliza selected fabric and thread with careful attention. When they brought their purchases to the counter, Murphy tallied them up without meeting their eyes. "That'll be $8.30, he said. Caleb paid in furs and cash, and Murphy counted it twice before nodding. "You two need anything else?" "Information," Caleb said. "The schoolhouse still sitting empty?" Murphy blinked in surprise. "The schoolhouse? Yeah, hasn't been used since old Mrs. Palmer died last fall. Why?" "Miss Hartley here's a teacher. Thought maybe the settlement could use one." Murphy's eyes shifted to Eliza, reassessing. "That right? You know your letters and such?" "I can read, write, and cipher," Eliza said quietly. "My mother taught me, and I taught children back in Ohio before I came west." "Huh." Murphy scratched his beard. "Well, I can't speak for everyone, but I got 3 young ones who could use proper learning. Wife tries to teach them, but she's got her hands full with the baby and the farm. You serious about this?" "I am," Eliza said, gaining confidence. "If people are willing to give me a chance." "Let me talk to some folks," Murphy said. "See what interest there is. Can't promise anything, but, well, We could use a teacher. Town's growing, and kids need educating. Thank you, Eliza said, and the genuine warmth in her voice made Murphy's weathered face soften. They left the store to find a small crowd had gathered. Not obvious, but people lingering on porches and near storefronts, watching. Caleb felt Eliza tense beside him and squeezed her elbow reassuringly. Let them look, he murmured. We're not doing anything wrong. Caleb Rourke! The voice came from across the street, and Caleb turned to see Samuel Wright, one of the settlement's founding families. Heard you were in town. Got a minute? Caleb and Eliza crossed to where Samuel stood with two other men, Jacob Foster and Daniel Chen, both trappers Caleb had known for years. Their faces were neutral, careful, and Caleb braced himself for confrontation. Samuel, he said evenly. Jacob. Daniel. We heard Miss Hartley's been staying up at your place, Samuel said without preamble. That true? It is. Caused quite a stir, that news. Samuel's expression gave nothing away. People talking? People always talk. What? Caleb's jaw set. What's your point? Point is, some folks think it's not proper. Man and woman living together without being married, that kind of thing. Samuel paused. But I told them they were being small-minded hypocrites. Caleb blinked in surprise. You did? I did. Samuel's face broke into a grin. Hell, Caleb, you saved my daughter's life when she got lost in that blizzard 10 years back. Tracked her for 3 days in weather that would have killed most men. If you want to offer shelter to a woman in need, that's your business, and anyone who says different can answer to me. And me, Jacob added. You're a good man, Caleb. Always have been. Don't care what the gossips say. Same here, Daniel said. Besides, Miss Hartley, I remember you from the bakery. You always gave my kids extra bread when they came in hungry. That's kindness. And kindness deserves kindness back. Eliza's eyes filled with tears. Thank you. All of you. You don't know what that means. We know what it means to be judged unfairly, Samuel said gently. This territory is supposed to be about fresh starts. People escaping old mistakes, old prejudices. If we can't offer that to our own, what good are we? Speaking of which, Jacob said, Murphy mentioned you might be interested in teaching our young ones. I am, Eliza said, if people are willing to have me. My wife would dance a jig if someone could teach our boys their letters, Jacob laughed. She's been begging me to find a tutor, but there's been no one qualified for 100 miles. You serious about this? Very serious. Then you've got at least 3 families interested right there, Samuel said, gesturing to include himself, Jacob, and Daniel. That's 9 children between us. Enough to start, I'd say. Caleb felt something tight in his chest loosen. These were the good people he'd told Eliza about, the ones who saw past surface judgment to the person underneath. Not everyone would be this kind, but having allies mattered. There's something else, Caleb said, making a decision in the moment. Something we need to tell you. Tell everyone, really. But you 3 should hear it first. Eliza looked at him sharply, but Caleb pressed on. I've asked Miss Hartley to stay on at my cabin, permanently. And come summer, if she's willing, I intend to ask her to marry me. The words hung in the air. Eliza's hand found his and gripped tight, her fingers trembling. The 3 men exchanged glances. Well, damn, Samuel said finally. That's news. Good news, I'd say, Jacob amended. You've been alone too long, Caleb. And Miss Hartley, if you can put up with this stubborn old mountain goat, you're a saint. I'm not stubborn, Caleb protested, and all 3 men burst out laughing. Caleb, Daniel said when he'd caught his breath, you once spent 3 weeks tracking a wolf that killed one of your chickens just on principle. You're the very definition of stubborn. Even Eliza smiled at that, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. Congratulations, Samuel said warmly, extending his hand to Caleb. Truly, you both deserve happiness. They shook hands all around, and when the men left, Caleb and Eliza stood together in the muddy street, watching them go. You just told them we're getting married, Eliza said quietly. But you haven't actually asked me yet. Caleb turned to face her. I know, I'm doing this all backwards, but I needed them to know, needed everyone to know, that this isn't some temporary arrangement, that you're not just living in my cabin, you're building a life there. With me, if that's what you want. It is what I want, Eliza said. But Caleb, you should know. Marriage to me won't be easy. People will judge you. The gossip will get worse before it gets better. Your life would be simpler if I don't want simpler. Caleb took both her hands. I want you, and I don't give a damn what anyone says about it. You say that now, I'll say it forever. His voice was fierce. Eliza, I spent 15 years choosing simple over living, choosing safety over connection, choosing nothing over the risk of something. I'm done with that. You hear me? I'm done. Eliza's tears spilled over, but she was smiling through them. Then yes, I'll marry you, whenever you ask me properly. How about right now? Caleb dropped to one knee in the muddy street, ignoring the shocked gasps from the people watching. Eliza Hartley, will you marry me? Will you build a life with me in these mountains? Will you let me spend whatever years I have left proving that you're the best thing that ever happened to me? Yes, Eliza laughed, pulling him to his feet. Yes, you stubborn, wonderful man. Yes. He kissed her then, right there in the middle of Red Ridge with half the settlement watching. It wasn't a long kiss or a passionate one. They were both too aware of their audience for that, but it was real and true and full of promise. When they pulled apart, someone started clapping. Then another person joined in, and another, until a small wave of applause rippled through the onlookers. Not everyone participated. Caleb saw Mrs. Henderson standing stiff-faced on her porch, and several others looked away in clear disapproval. But enough people clapped that it felt like acceptance. Well, Eliza said, her cheeks flushed. That's done then. That's done, Caleb agreed. They finished their business in town, stopping by the bakery where Mueller grudgingly paid Eliza the wages he owed her, visiting the blacksmith to order materials for expanding the cabin, and checking in with Murphy about when Eliza could start teaching. By the time they headed back up the mountain trail, the sun was high and warm, and Caleb felt lighter than he had in years. They'll still talk, Eliza said as they walked. Some of them will never accept this. I know, but enough of them will. That's all we need. Is it really? She looked at him seriously. Caleb, you've lived here your whole life. These are your people. What if choosing me means losing them? Then they were never really my people to begin with. Caleb stopped walking and turned to face her. Listen to me. I lost Margaret, and it nearly destroyed me. I lost Thomas to my own stubbornness and grief. I spent 15 years losing myself piece by piece until there was almost nothing left. I'm not losing you too. Not to gossip, not to judgment, not to anything. You're worth more than all of them combined. Eliza reached up and touched his face gently. How did I get so lucky? Luck had nothing to do with it. You were brave enough to keep going when everything told you to quit. That's not luck. That's strength. They continued up the trail, and as the cabin came into view through the trees, Caleb felt a sense of rightness settle over him. This was home. Not because of the logs and the roof and the fireplace, but because Eliza was there. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. Word spread through Red Ridge about Eliza's teaching offer, and within days she had commitments from 12 families representing 23 children ranging from ages 5 to 15. The old schoolhouse was cleaned out and repaired, and Eliza began classes 3 days a week, walking the trail to town and back with Caleb, accompanying her when his work allowed. The children took to her immediately. She had a gift for making learning feel like discovery rather than drudgery, and even the older boys who'd expected to mock her found themselves engaged despite themselves. Parents reported their children coming home excited about reading, eager to practice their letters, begging for more books. You're good at this, Caleb said one evening, watching her prepare lessons by lamplight. Better than good. You're changing those kids' lives. I'm just teaching them to read, Eliza protested. You're teaching them they're worth educating. That's bigger than reading. Caleb set down the harness he was mending. Their parents see it too. Jacob told me his oldest wants to be a lawyer now. Says if he can read well enough, he can study law books and make something of himself. Samuel's daughter asked if I could teach her Latin, Eliza said, wonder in her voice. Latin. She wants to be a doctor. See, you're not just teaching letters, you're teaching possibilities. But not everyone was pleased with Eliza's success. The criticism came from predictable quarters. Mrs. Henderson complained that Eliza was putting ideas above station into children's heads, that education would make them dissatisfied with honest labor. The town's minister, a stern man named Reverend Blackwood, preached a Sunday sermon about the dangers of unmarried cohabitation and the corruption of innocent minds by those living in sin. Caleb heard about the sermon secondhand and went to find the reverend at his small cabin behind the church. "We need to talk," Caleb said when Blackwood opened his door. "Mr. Rourke, I wondered when you'd come." The reverend was a tall, thin man with cold eyes. "Here to defend your arrangement?" "Here to tell you to leave Eliza alone." Caleb's voice was quiet but hard. "You want to judge me? Fine, I can take it. But she's done nothing wrong except survive circumstances she didn't choose and try to make something better of her life. She's living in sin with a man old enough to be her father," Blackwood said flatly. "Corrupting the morals of this community's children? That's not nothing, Mr. Rourke. She's teaching children to read and write and think. If that's corruption, we need more of it." Caleb stepped closer. "And our living situation is temporary. We're getting married come summer. That doesn't erase the sin already committed." "What sin?" Caleb's patience was fraying. "Kindness? Offering shelter to someone in need? Working together to survive? If that's sin in your book, then your book's wrong." "Be careful, Mr. Rourke. Pride comes before— Save your scripture for someone who wants to hear it." Caleb cut him off. "I came here as a courtesy to tell you face to face. Leave Eliza alone. Stop using your pulpit to attack her. She's a good woman doing good work. And if you can't see that, the failing's yours, not hers. I speak the truth as I see it." "Then maybe you need to look harder." Caleb turned to leave, then paused. "You know what I think? I think you're threatened. Here's a woman with no husband, no family, no money, and she's making a bigger difference in this town than you've made in 3 years of preaching. That must sting." He left before Blackwood could respond, but the confrontation sat heavy on his shoulders. Walking back to the cabin, Caleb wondered if he'd made things better or worse. Eliza was waiting on the porch when he arrived, her arms crossed against the evening chill. "You went to see Blackwood," she said. It wasn't a question. "How'd you know?" "Murphy's wife told me he was preaching against us. I figured you'd do something stubborn." She smiled slightly. "How did it go?" "About as well as expected." Caleb climbed the porch steps and sat beside her. "I may have made an enemy." "You already had one. But Caleb, you can't fight every person who disapproves of us. There will always be someone." "I know, but I can fight the ones who try to hurt you." Eliza leaned against his shoulder. "My hero." "I'm serious." "So am I." She took his hand. "But we have to be smart about this. Fighting Blackwood directly just gives him ammunition, makes us look defensive. So what do? We live well. We do good work. We prove through our actions that what we have is real and right." Eliza's voice was calm, thoughtful. "The children love their lessons. The parents are grateful. That matters more than one bitter minister's opinions." She was right, and Caleb knew it. But the protective instinct Eliza inspired in him was hard to temper. He wanted to shield her from every harsh word, every judgmental look. He wanted the world to see her the way he did, strong and kind and deserving of every good thing. "I love you," he said suddenly. They hadn't said the words yet, had been circling around them for weeks like nervous animals. But sitting here on the porch in the gathering dark, Caleb couldn't hold them back anymore. "I love you, Eliza. More than I thought I could love anyone again." Eliza lifted her head from his shoulder, her eyes bright in the dimness. "I love you too. I think I have for a while now. I was just afraid to say it." "Afraid of what?" "That it was too soon, that you'd think I was just grateful for shelter and kindness, that I'd somehow cheapen it by saying it out loud." She smiled, sad and sweet. "Stupid fears." "Not stupid, careful." Caleb pulled her closer. "But you don't have to be careful with me. Not anymore." They sat together as the stars came out, watching the valley settle into night. Somewhere below, an owl called, and the creek sang its endless song over stone. The world was vast and indifferent, full of people who would judge and criticize and condemn. But here, on this porch, in this moment, they had each other. And that was enough. The days grew longer and warmer. Caleb began the serious work of expanding the cabin. Not just one additional room, but two, creating proper separate spaces and a larger main living area. He worked with the focus of a man building toward a future he could see clearly now, and several men from town came up to help, bringing their labor as wedding gifts. "Heard you're making an honest woman of Miss Hartley," Samuel said one afternoon, helping Caleb frame a wall. "About time." "We're getting married in June," Caleb confirmed. "Simple ceremony. You're invited." "Wouldn't miss it." Samuel hammered a nail with practiced precision. "My wife's already planning what to bring for the celebration. Says every wedding needs a proper feast." "That's kind of her." "She likes Eliza. Says any woman who can turn my wild boys into eager students has to have magic in her." Samuel grinned. "Plus she's happy you're not alone anymore. We all are." The words warmed Caleb more than he could express. He'd been alone for so long that he'd forgotten what community felt like, the way good people looked out for each other, celebrated each other's joys, supported each other through hard times. By mid-May, the expansion was complete. The cabin now had 2 bedrooms, a larger main room with space for a proper dining table, and a covered porch that wrapped around 2 sides. It was the finest home Caleb had ever built, every board placed with care, every joint fitted with pride. "It's beautiful," Eliza breathed when he showed her the finished work. "Caleb, it's more than I ever dreamed of." "You deserve more than dreams," Caleb said. "You deserve a real home. A good life. Everything." She kissed him then, and he held her in the middle of their new home, feeling the weight of future years settling around them like a blessing. The wedding was set for the first Saturday in June. Simple and small, just family and friends gathered at the cabin. But 3 days before the ceremony, something happened that changed everything. A rider came up the trail in the late afternoon, unusual enough that Caleb went outside with his rifle, cautious. But as the horse drew closer, his heart stopped. He knew that horse, knew that rider. "Thomas?" The name came out barely a whisper. His son dismounted slowly, and Caleb saw he wasn't alone. A woman sat on the horse behind him holding an infant, and 2 small children clung to her waist. "Hello, Pa," Thomas said quietly. His face was older, lined with worry and work, but his eyes were the same ones Caleb had looked into 32 years ago when his son was born. "I hope we're not intruding. We had nowhere else to go." Caleb felt Eliza arrive beside him, her hand finding his. He gripped it hard, needing the anchor, struggling to process what he was seeing. "You're not intruding," he managed finally. "You're home. You're all home." Thomas's face crumpled with relief, and suddenly he was crossing the distance between them, and Caleb was embracing his son for the first time in 8 years, both of them crying, neither caring who saw. The mountain man who'd believed his life was ending had just been given back a piece of his heart he'd thought lost forever. And standing beside him, holding his hand and welcoming strangers with open arms, was the woman who'd taught him that endings could also be beginnings. Thomas pulled back from the embrace, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand, and gestured to the woman still sitting on the horse. "Pa, this is my wife, Sarah, and our children, Emma, she's 6, and little James is 4, the baby's Margaret. We named her after Ma." Caleb felt his throat close at that. He looked at the tiny bundle in Sarah's arms, at this granddaughter he'd never known existed, bearing his lost wife's name. The weight of lost years pressed against his chest, but Eliza's hand in his kept him grounded. "Sarah," he said, his voice rough, "it's good to meet you, all of you." He turned to Eliza. "This is Eliza Hartley. We're to be married Saturday." Sarah's tired face lit with surprise and genuine warmth. "Married? Oh, that's wonderful. Thomas, did you hear?" "I heard." Thomas looked at Eliza with careful assessment, the way a son evaluates the woman who's replaced his mother in his father's life. But there was no hostility in his gaze, only cautious curiosity. "Miss Hartley, it's a pleasure. Please, call me Eliza." She stepped forward, still holding Caleb's hand. "You must be exhausted from your journey. Let's get you all inside and settled. We can talk once everyone's warm and fed." The next hour was a flurry of activity. Caleb helped Sarah down from the horse while Eliza ushered the children inside, exclaiming over the newly expanded cabin. Thomas tended to the horse, unsaddling it and leading it to the small corral Caleb had built. By the time he returned, Eliza had water heating for washing, bread and cheese laid out for the children, and coffee brewing. "This is quite a place you've built, Pa," Thomas said quietly, looking around the cabin. His eyes lingered on the new rooms, the careful craftsmanship, the touches that showed a home being actively lived in and loved. Had help. Caleb poured coffee into cups. And motivation. Sarah sat at the table with baby Margaret on her lap, while Emma and James devoured bread with the single-minded focus of hungry children. She was younger than Caleb had expected, maybe 30, with gentle features and worried eyes. "I'm sorry to arrive unannounced," she said softly. "Thomas wanted to write first, but circumstances, well, we had to leave quickly." "What happened?" Caleb asked, sitting across from her. Thomas and Sarah exchanged glances, and Caleb saw the weight of bad news in the look. "The mill closed," Thomas said finally. "In Pennsylvania. I was working as a bookkeeper there, had been for 6 years. Good steady work, enough to keep us comfortable. But the owner made some bad investments, and the whole operation went under. Half the town lost their jobs. We tried to stay," Sarah added, bouncing Margaret gently. "Thomas found temporary work here and there, but it wasn't enough. We fell behind on rent, and then the landlord—" She trailed off, color rising in her cheeks. "The landlord what?" Caleb's voice took on an edge. "He suggested Sarah could work off our debt in ways that weren't acceptable," Thomas said flatly, anger tightening his jaw. "So I broke his nose, and we left before he could have me arrested. Sold everything we could carry, bought the horse, and headed west. I figured maybe we could start over out here. Maybe I'd help," Caleb finished. "Of course I'll help. You're my son. This is your home too." Thomas's eyes grew bright again. "I wasn't sure you'd want us. After the things I said when I left, after I stayed away so long." "You were right about most of it," Caleb admitted. "I was bitter, selfish, trapped in grief and calling it loyalty. You were smart to leave when you did. I should have written more. Should have brought Sarah to meet you when we married. Should have told you about the children." Thomas shook his head. "I kept meaning to, but years passed, and it got easier to just stay away than face how much time we'd lost." "We've both made mistakes," Caleb said. "But you're here now. That's what matters." Eliza had been listening quietly while preparing a simple stew from the supplies on hand. Now she spoke up, her voice practical and warm. "The question is what comes next. Sarah, how long since you've slept in a real bed?" 3 weeks, Sarah admitted. "We've been camping along the trail, traveling slowly with the children. Then tonight you'll sleep in one of the new bedrooms, all of you together, where it's warm and safe." Eliza stirred the stew with calm efficiency. "Tomorrow, we'll figure out the rest. But tonight, you rest." Sarah's eyes filled with grateful tears. "You're very kind, especially considering we've disrupted your wedding preparations." "You haven't disrupted anything," Eliza assured her. "You've made it better. What's a wedding without family?" That night, with Thomas's family settled in one of the new bedrooms and the cabin quiet, Caleb and Eliza sat by the fire in the main room, speaking in low voices. "Are you all right?" Eliza asked, her hand finding his in the dimness. "I don't know," Caleb admitted. "I never thought I'd see him again. And now he's here with a whole family I knew nothing about. A granddaughter named Margaret." His voice broke slightly. "I've missed so much. But you have the chance to be part of their lives now. That's not nothing. What if they stay?" Caleb looked at her seriously. "What if they need to stay here long term? We'd have to expand again, make more room. Our lives would be completely different than what we planned." Eliza was quiet for a moment, considering. Would that be so terrible? Having family around, children in the house? It would change everything. Everything's already changed, Caleb. 6 months ago, you were alone in a cabin waiting to die. Now you're getting married, teaching me to hunt, building a home. She smiled. Adding a few more people to that doesn't seem like the impossible part. Caleb pulled her close, marveling at her capacity for adaptation, for welcome, for making space in her heart for strangers who'd appeared without warning. You're remarkable. You know that? I'm practical, Eliza corrected. And I know what it's like to need help and have nowhere to go. I won't turn away your family when they need us. Our family, Caleb said firmly. Once we're married, they're ours, all of it. Over the next few days, the household found its rhythm. Thomas proved himself handy with repairs and construction, and he and Caleb began planning an additional structure, a smaller cabin nearby where Thomas's family could live independently while still being close. Sarah helped Eliza with cooking and childcare, and the two women developed an easy rapport that surprised everyone, perhaps most of all themselves. The children were a revelation. Emma was bright and curious, following Eliza around, asking endless questions and begging to help with everything. James was quieter, more cautious, but he attached himself to Caleb with fierce devotion, trailing after his grandfather and imitating his movements with adorable seriousness. "He likes you," Thomas observed one afternoon, watching James try to chop wood with a stick while Caleb worked nearby. "He's a good boy," Caleb said. "They both are. You've raised them well." Sarah did most of it. I was working long hours trying to provide." Thomas set down the board he'd been measuring. "Pa, I need to say something. An apology, really, for what I said when I left." Caleb straightened, his back protesting slightly. "You don't—" "I do." Thomas's voice was firm. "I told you that you were choosing to be miserable, that you were disrespecting Ma's memory by refusing to move forward. I was cruel, and I was wrong." "You were right," Caleb corrected. "Maybe not in how you said it, but in the substance. I was stuck, frozen, half dead, and calling it devotion. Still, I shouldn't have—" "Thomas." Caleb waited until his son met his eyes. "We both made mistakes. We both said things we regret. But you coming back here, bringing your family, giving me a chance to know my grandchildren, that's worth more than any apology. So let's call it even and move forward. What do you say?" Thomas nodded, blinking hard. "Even." They worked together in comfortable silence after that, the years of distance beginning to close through shared labor and mutual grace. On Friday, the day before the wedding, Caleb and Eliza made a trip to town together for final preparations. They brought Thomas and Sarah along, wanting to introduce them to the community and begin establishing connections for Thomas to find work. Red Ridge had transformed in the spring warmth. Gardens were being planted, new buildings were under construction, and the main street bustled with activity. News of Caleb's son's return had already spread. Samuel's wife had a network of information that rivaled any telegraph, and people approached them with curious welcome. "So this is the famous Thomas," Samuel said, shaking hands warmly. "Your father's told me about you." "Bookkeeper?" your wife said. "I was. Looking for work now, though. Any kind of honest labor." "But can you do figures?" Samuel's eyes sharpened with interest. "Keep accounts, tally shipments, that kind of thing?" "I can. I'm good with numbers." "Then come by my warehouse Monday morning. I've been doing my own books, but I'm losing track of what's what. Could use someone with actual training." Samuel named a fair wage, and Thomas accepted with visible relief. Similar offers came throughout the day. The blacksmith needed help with his accounts. The general store wanted someone to manage inventory. Even Reverend Blackwood, for all his earlier criticism, admitted the church needed better financial organization. "Seems like you'll have your pick of work," Caleb said as they walked toward the schoolhouse, where Eliza wanted to introduce Sarah to some of the mothers. "I can't believe it," Thomas admitted. "Back east, I sent out 50 applications and got nothing. Here, people are offering work before I even ask." "That's frontier life," Caleb said. "People need skills more than they need perfect strangers. You prove yourself useful, you've got a place." At the schoolhouse, Sarah was immediately welcomed by the mothers whose children Eliza taught. They peppered her with questions about life back east, cooed over baby Margaret, and invited her to their weekly gathering. "They're so kind," Sarah said wonderingly as they walked back to the horses. "I expected judgment, questions about why we left, why we came here without warning. Instead, they just welcomed us." "That's what good people do," Eliza said simply. "And there are more good people than bad ones. You just have to give them a chance to show it." That evening, back at the cabin, Caleb found Thomas sitting on the new porch, staring out at the mountains as the sun set behind them in spectacular shades of orange and gold. "Beautiful, isn't it?" Caleb settled into the chair beside him. "I'd forgotten," Thomas said quietly. "How big everything feels out here. How much space there is. Back east, everything was crowded, cramped. Even the sky felt smaller." "You planning to stay, beyond just finding your feet, I mean?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment. "Would that be all right? If we did stay, built a life here?" "More than all right." Caleb's voice was rough with emotion. It would be, it would mean everything, Thomas. To have you close, to watch my grandchildren grow up, to be part of your lives. I want that too, Thomas said. I think I always did. I was just too proud and too hurt to admit it. I blamed you for Ma's death, which wasn't fair. She died from fever, not from anything you did or didn't do, but I needed someone to be angry at, and you were there. And I blamed you for leaving, Caleb admitted. Took it as a rejection instead of what it was. A young man finding his own path. We've both been fools. Good thing it's not too late to change that. Thomas smiled, the expression transforming his serious face. Tell me about Eliza. Really tell me. How did you two meet? Caleb told him the whole story. The town square, the stable, the winter storm, the slow transformation of two broken people finding their way toward healing. Thomas listened without interrupting, and when Caleb finished, he nodded thoughtfully. She's good for you. I can see it in how you carry yourself. You stand straighter, smile more. You're alive again, Pa. Really alive. She saved me, Caleb said simply, in every way a person can be saved. Then I'm grateful to her, and I'm glad you found each other. The wedding dawned clear and warm, with a sky so blue it hurt to look at directly. Eliza woke before sunrise, too nervous to sleep, and found Sarah already awake in the main room, nursing baby Margaret by the fire. Couldn't sleep either? Sarah asked with a knowing smile. Too much to think about. Eliza poured herself coffee with trembling hands. What if I mess up my vows? What if the dress doesn't fit right? What if you're marrying a good man who loves you and nothing else matters? Sarah interrupted gently. Eliza, I've watched you two together these past few days. The way he looks at you, the way you anticipate each other's needs, that's real. That's solid. Everything else is just decoration. I've never been a bride before, Eliza admitted. Never thought I would be. I don't know how to do this. There's no right way. You just show up, say the words, and mean them. Sarah shifted Margaret to her other side. The rest takes care of itself. The ceremony was held in the meadow behind the cabin, with wildflowers blooming in riotous color and the mountains rising majestic in the background. Samuel had agreed to officiate. Redridge was too small and too practical to insist on formal religious ceremonies, and besides, Reverend Blackwood had made his disapproval clear. Chairs had been brought up from town for the 30 or so people who'd made the journey. Emma and young James scattered flower petals with solemn concentration, while baby Margaret slept peacefully in Sarah's arms. Thomas stood beside his father, a silent show of support that meant more than any words could convey. And Eliza walked across the meadow in a dress she'd sewn herself from fabric the women of Redridge had gifted her. Simple cream linen with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Her hair was braided with wild flowers woven through it, and she carried a small bouquet of mountain sage and columbine. She was beautiful. Not in the conventional way the world measured such things, but in the way that mattered, with clear eyes and a brave smile and hands that reached for his without hesitation. You came, Caleb said softly as she took her place beside him. Did you doubt it? Not for a second. Samuel cleared his throat and addressed the gathered crowd. We're here today to witness the joining of Caleb Rourke and Eliza Hartley in marriage. Now, I'm no preacher and I don't have fancy words, but I know these two people and I know what they've overcome to stand here today. Caleb lost his way for a long time after his wife died. Eliza faced hardships that would have broken most people, but somehow they found each other, and in finding each other, they found themselves again. That's not just love, that's resurrection. There were murmurs of agreement from the crowd. Caleb saw Samuel's wife dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief, Jacob grinning broadly, Daniel nodding in approval. Caleb, Samuel continued, do you take Eliza to be your wife? To stand beside her in good times and bad? To build a life together? To honor and cherish her all your days? I do, Caleb said, his voice steady and strong, with everything I am. Eliza, do you take Caleb to be your husband? To stand beside him in good times and bad? To build a life together? To honor and cherish him all your days? I do, Eliza said, tears streaming down her face but smiling through them. With everything I am. Then by the authority vested in me, by all of us here who say it's so, I declare you married. Caleb, you can kiss your bride. He did, gently and thoroughly, while their friends and family cheered and Emma shouted, "Hooray!" at the top of her lungs. The celebration that followed was simple but joyful. The women had brought food: roasted meat, fresh bread, early vegetables from gardens, precious sweets made with hoarded sugar. Someone produced a fiddle, and dancing began in the meadow as the afternoon sun warmed the mountain air. Children ran wild, playing games while adults talked and laughed and toasted the newlyweds with whatever they had to drink. Caleb danced with Eliza, then with Emma, who demanded her turn, then with Sarah, who thanked him for welcoming her family so graciously. Thomas danced with Eliza, and Caleb saw them talking seriously as they moved, his son's expression warm and accepting. "What were you two discussing?" Caleb asked Eliza later when they had a moment alone. "He was telling me about your wife. About Margaret." Eliza smiled. "He wanted me to know that accepting me doesn't mean forgetting her, that there's room in his heart for both of us." "Smart boy," Caleb said gruffly. "Smart man," Eliza corrected. "You raised him well, Caleb. Even through the grief, even through the hard years, he turned out good." As evening fell and the guests began departing, with promises to visit soon and offers of help with whatever the newlyweds needed, Caleb stood with his arm around Eliza's waist and watched the sun sink behind the western peaks. Thomas approached with James on his shoulders and Emma holding his hand. "We'll sleep in the addition tonight. Give you two some privacy." "You don't have to," Caleb started. "We do," Thomas said firmly. "It's your wedding night. Besides, the kids are exhausted and Sarah's already made up beds. We'll see you in the morning." He ushered his family away, and suddenly Caleb and Eliza were alone in the meadow as twilight deepened around them. "So," Eliza said softly, "we're married." "We're married," Caleb confirmed, wonder in his voice. "What now?" "Now we live." He pulled her closer. "We wake up tomorrow and the day after that and all the days we're given. We build our lives. We love our family. We make mistakes and fix them and keep going. That sounds perfect." They stood together as the first stars emerged, two people who'd been broken and alone now, whole and together, and the mountain stood witness to their quiet promises whispered in the gathering dark. The months that followed brought changes as profound as they were unexpected. Thomas and Caleb built the second cabin working side by side, the structure rising quick and solid through the summer. Thomas settled into work keeping books for 3 different businesses in Red Ridge, his education and skill making him valuable in a way that transcended any questions about where he'd come from or why. Sarah became fast friends with Eliza, and the two women often taught together, Eliza handling the older children's academics while Sarah led the younger ones through their letters. The schoolhouse expanded to accommodate 32 students, and plans were being drawn for a larger building come spring. Emma and James thrived in the mountain air, growing strong and wild and happy. James became Caleb's shadow, learning to track and hunt and read the forest signs. Emma studied fiercely under Eliza's tutelage and announced she would be a teacher herself someday. And baby Margaret, named for a grandmother she'd never know, grew from infant to toddler, her first steps taken in the meadow where her grandparents had married, her first words shouted with joy from the porch of a cabin built on hope. Caleb and Eliza's marriage deepened through shared labor and quiet evenings, and the accumulation of small moments that built a life. There were disagreements, of course. Caleb could be stubborn, and Eliza had strong opinions about how things should be done. But they'd learned to talk through problems rather than retreat into silence. One evening in late autumn, almost a year after Eliza had first arrived at the cabin, the whole family gathered for dinner. The table Caleb had built seated 8 now, and every chair was full. Thomas carved a roasted duck while Sarah passed vegetables and Eliza served fresh bread. Emma chattered about her lessons while James demonstrated the proper way to hold a hunting knife. Baby Margaret banged her spoon on the table with delighted enthusiasm. It was chaos. It was loud. It was nothing like the silent, careful existence Caleb had maintained for 15 years. It was perfect. "Pa?" Thomas said during a lull in the conversation. "Sarah and I wanted to tell you something. We're expecting again. Baby's due in spring." Eliza gasped with delight and immediately began planning, her mind already leaping to what they'd need, how to prepare. Sarah beamed, and the children asked excited questions about whether they'd have a brother or sister. But Caleb just sat there, overwhelmed by the fullness of it all. Another grandchild coming, his son happy and settled and building a life here in these mountains. His wife, glowing with joy and already treating Thomas's children as if they were her own. "You all right, old man?" Thomas asked with gentle teasing. "More than all right." Caleb's voice was rough. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." That winter was mild, and when spring arrived, it brought not just Thomas and Sarah's new baby, a boy they named Caleb, but also news that spread through Red Ridge like wildfire. Eliza was pregnant. She told Caleb on a morning in early May, pulling him aside before breakfast with tears in her eyes and a trembling smile. "Are you sure?" he asked, hardly daring to believe it. "I'm sure. Sarah helped me confirm it. Caleb, we're going to have a baby." He pulled her close, his own eyes wet, overwhelmed by this gift he'd never thought to receive again. At 52 years old, Caleb Rourke was going to be a father once more. "Are you happy?" Eliza asked against his chest. "I'm terrified," he admitted, and thrilled, and grateful beyond words. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through summer and into fall. Sarah proved invaluable, having just been through it herself, and the women of Red Ridge rallied around Eliza with advice and support and gifts of tiny clothes and blankets. Thomas helped Caleb expand the cabin one more time, adding another small bedroom for the baby. "Never thought I'd be building a nursery for my own sibling," Thomas joked as they worked. "Never thought I'd be changing diapers at my age," Caleb countered. "Life's full of surprises. Good ones, though. The best ones." The baby came on a cold November night, arriving in a rush after only a few hours of labor. Caleb paced outside while Sarah and the midwife attended Eliza, Thomas keeping him company and offering whiskey to steady his nerves. When the baby's first cry split the night, Caleb's knees nearly gave out with relief. Sarah emerged smiling. "You have a daughter. Both mother and baby are healthy." Caleb rushed inside to find Eliza propped up in bed, exhausted and radiant, holding a tiny red-faced bundle. She looked up at him with such love and joy that his heart felt too large for his chest. "Meet your daughter," she said softly. He took the baby carefully, marveling at her tiny fingers and perfect features. She had Eliza's dark eyes and his own stubborn chin, and she was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. "What should we name her?" Eliza asked. Caleb thought about it, this new life cradled in his arms, this impossible gift born from unlikely love. He thought about the journey that had brought them all here, the grief and loneliness, the chance encounter in a town square, the slow building of trust and partnership and devotion. "Hope," he said finally. "Her name is Hope." And so Hope Rourke entered the world, joining a family that had been built not from blood alone, but from choice and courage and the willingness to believe that broken things could be made whole. The years that followed were full in ways Caleb had forgotten life could be. The household expanded and contracted as children grew and seasons changed. Emma went off to a teaching college back east, sponsored by the territorial governor himself after her exceptional scores caught his attention. James stayed, learning his grandfather's tracking skills and eventually becoming Red Ridge's official guide for hunting parties and lost travelers. Thomas's family grew to include 5 children eventually, and he became one of the most respected businessmen in the territory. Sarah opened a small school of her own in Red Ridge proper, working alongside Eliza to educate 2 generations of frontier children. And Caleb and Eliza raised Hope together, marveling at her fierce intelligence and kind heart. She grew up running wild through mountain meadows, learning to read from her mother and track from her father, beloved by siblings and cousins alike. On Hope's 5th birthday, Caleb stood on the porch of the cabin, now a sprawling compound of connected buildings, and watched his family celebrate in the meadow below. Children ran and played, adults talked and laughed, and at the center of it all was his daughter, crowned with flowers and grinning with gap-toothed joy. Eliza came to stand beside him, her hand finding his as naturally as breathing. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "That I'm the luckiest man alive," Caleb said. "That I don't deserve any of this, but I'm grateful for it anyway." "You deserve all of it." Eliza leaned against his shoulder. "You chose to live again when it would have been easier to give up. You opened your heart when you could have stayed closed. That takes courage." "I had good motivation." He kissed the top of her head. "You showed me it was possible, that life could be more than just waiting for the end." "We showed each other," Eliza corrected. I was just as stuck as you were, just in a different way. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching their daughter chase her cousins through the wildflowers while the sun painted the mountains gold. People in Redridge had stopped whispering about the mountain man and the woman from the stable years ago. Now they told their children the story as an inspiration, how two broken people had found each other and built something beautiful from the wreckage of their separate pains. They called Caleb Rourke the man who proved that courage wasn't just about surviving the wilderness. Sometimes it was about daring to live again when every part of you wanted to give up, about opening your door to a stranger in need, about choosing hope over bitterness and love over fear. They called Eliza Rourke the teacher who transformed their community, who gave their children dreams beyond subsistence and survival. But those who knew her best understood her greater gift was showing people that worth wasn't determined by appearance or circumstance, but by the strength of your heart and the grace with which you treated others. Together, they'd become a legend, not the dramatic kind sung in ballads, but the quiet, powerful kind that changed a community from the inside out. Years later, when Caleb was 70 and Eliza was 58, they sat on that same porch watching their grandchildren, now numbering 12, play in the meadow. Thomas had silver threading through his hair now, and Sarah walked with a cane after a fall had injured her hip. Emma had returned from back east with a husband and was teaching at a university in Denver. James had married the blacksmith's daughter, and they were expecting their third child. And Hope, grown into a beautiful woman of 20, taught at her mother's side and was courting a young lawyer who'd come west to make his fortune and found love instead. "We did all right," Caleb said, his voice rougher with age but still strong. "We did better than all right," Eliza corrected. "We did beautifully." "No regrets?" "Only that we didn't find each other sooner." She squeezed his hand. "But maybe we needed all those hard years to appreciate what we have now." "Maybe so." They watched the sun set behind the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of fire and gold, and Caleb thought about the long journey that had brought him to this moment. The grief and isolation, the chance encounter, the slow building of trust and love, the expansion of his heart to include not just Eliza but Thomas's family, and then Hope, and then all the other lives that had touched theirs and been touched in return. He thought about the man he'd been at 50, bitter, alone, waiting for death in a silent cabin, and he thought about the man he'd become, surrounded by family, still strong enough to ride the trap lines, still learning new things from his remarkable wife. The mountain man who'd believed his life was over had lived another 20 years, and they'd been the richest, fullest years he'd ever known. "I love you," he said to Eliza, the words as true now as they'd been on their wedding day. "I love you too," she replied. "And I'm grateful every day that you were stubborn enough to step into that town square and brave enough to offer shelter to a stranger. Best decision I ever made." "Second best," Eliza corrected with a smile. "The best was choosing to actually live the life we built, instead of just going through the motions." Caleb pulled her close, and they sat together as the stars emerged one by one, listening to their family's laughter drift up from the meadow below. The mountains stood eternal and unchanging around them, but within their embrace, everything had transformed. Two broken people had dared to heal together, and in doing so they'd created something that would outlast them both. A family built on second chances, a community strengthened by compassion, and a legacy that proved the most profound courage wasn't facing down bears or surviving winters. It was choosing to love again after loss, choosing to hope again after despair, choosing to live fully and bravely in the face of all the reasons not to. The mountain man and the woman everyone looked down on had become legends, not through grand gestures, but through the quiet, daily choice to build a life worth living. And in the end, that was the greatest victory of all. 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 Greatest victory